Final Fantasy is one of my favourite franchises in all of gaming, so unsurprisingly, Final Fantasy XVI has been near the top of my most anticipated games list since its reveal in 2020. From the second I saw the first trailer for 16, I was intrigued by the game's dark and sombre tone and stylish action combat. And knowing that this game had such a legendary lineup of talent working on it, with Final Fantasy XVI being developed by Creative Business Unit 3, the team led by Naoki Yoshida, who were responsible for the fan favourite Final Fantasy XIV, and with former Capcom dev Ryota Suzuki, who worked on games like Devil May Cry 5 and Dragon's Dogma during his time there, serving as 16's battle designer, I was expecting Final Fantasy XVI to be something special. And after beating and 100%ing 16, I'm glad to say that it certainly is. Final Fantasy XVI is an exceptional game with excellent combat mechanics, epic boss battles that offer an unparalleled degree of spectacle, and a wonderful cast of fleshed out characters. Final Fantasy XVI is a true epic of a story, as it follows its protagonist Clive Rosfield throughout 3 decades of his life. Not many games show us such a large percentage of their protagonists' lives, but in doing so, 16 is able to showcase growth and development in Clive to an extent we've never seen in a Final Fantasy protagonist before. When we first meet Clive, he's 15 years old, and we learn that he's the firstborn son of the Kingdom of Rosaria's Archduke, and the sworn protector of his younger brother Joshua, who is a dominant, with dominants being the human hosts for all the classic Final Fantasy summons like Titan, Shiva, and Ifrit, with Joshua being the dominant of Phoenix. Think of dominants like Jinchuriki in Naruto if you want to be even more nerdy about it. These dominants are viewed as weapons of mass destruction and are divided between nations. They're essentially treated like this world's version of nukes. Despite coming from royalty, things are far from easy for Clive, as Clive has quite a horrific family dynamic. While he loves his brother and his father Elwyn is a kind, benevolent leader, Clive's mother Annabella is cold and cruel, resenting Clive for not inheriting the power of the Phoenix and viewing him as nothing but a failure. So Clive spends his life playing second fiddle to Joshua. Clive's mother is so reprehensible. She's one of those Joffrey tier characters where you're just dying to see her get her comeuppance. The actress who plays Annabella, Christina Cole, does such a fantastic job of making the character as unlikable as possible. Not since Dolores Umbridge has a character been so immediately hateable. Thankfully, Clive's father does stand up for him, and in one particularly cathartic scene, calls Annabella out for her despicable attitude, telling her that the royal blood she cares so much for would have long ago been spilt in a gutter if not for men like Clive. Clive is an immediately likeable protagonist, thanks in no small part to Ben Starr's incredible performance. He's required to showcase the full emotional spectrum throughout 16, as Clive experiences anger, guilt, love, and sorrow, and he does so effortlessly, bringing Clive to life with the perfect blend of strength and kindness. Clive is easily one of the best protagonists to grace the Final Fantasy series thus far. After a brief prologue, 16's story really gets going when we see Clive's village get raided and destroyed as part of a coup by the Empire, leading to Clive being enslaved as a soldier in the Empire's army for 13 years. Eventually, Clive abandons his orders while behind enemy lines to set out on a quest for revenge against those who destroyed his home and took his family from him. It's around this point where Clive awakens the power of an Eicon within himself, realising that he's been a dominant all along, so he might just have the power to make a real change in this awful and corrupt world. Thankfully for Clive, he has plenty of allies alongside him on his journey, including Jill, dominant of the ice icon Shiva, and Clive's childhood friend, who was taken in by his family when she became an orphan of war, and Cid, dominant of the lightning Eicon Ramu, and leader of the rebellion against the Empire, who pulls Clive into his cause, showing Clive that there are more important things in this world than just his need for revenge, and setting him on the right path to become something more, the person who can stand up for the voiceless and oppressed. Jill is a fantastic character, and her relationship with Clive was the heart of 16 for me. She's also arguably the character who undergoes the most growth throughout the game. By stepping up and facing her demons, she blossoms into one of the most well-rounded and fully developed characters in 16. And I'll say it now, Final Fantasy XVI's Cid is the best of all the many Cids featured throughout the Final Fantasy series. He's the perfect mentor figure for Clive, and the dry humour Ralph Ineson brings to the role fits perfectly. I'd also be remiss to not give a special shout out to one of Clive's most loyal companions, his dog Torgal, who's introduced as the cutest puppy you've ever seen in your life, before growing into one of Clive's fiercest companions in battle. And yes, there is of course a button to pet Torgal, which you should do regularly because he's a good dog, and not just because there's a trophy for doing it 5 times. The kinship Clive develops with all of these characters is a huge part of what makes 16 feel so special. Their bonds feel genuine, which had me invested in this cast to the same degree I was in the casts of Persona 4 and 5, and those are 2 of my favourite games ever, so that's saying a lot. This is potentially the best ensemble ever assembled for a Final Fantasy game. Even beyond the core cast that drives the story forward, the minor characters back at your home base, like Lady Karen, the sassy old lady who runs the store, and the curmudgeonly blacksmith Blackthorn, bring so much to 16. Final Fantasy XVI also features a strong lineup of villains, several of whom I did a complete 180 on in my opinion of. I won't get into the antagonists who were introduced in the back half of the game, but 2 major players throughout much of 16 are Hugo Kupka and Benedicta. Early on, I found these 2 so over the top, to the point that they almost felt like moustache-twirling villains, and I wasn't particularly enjoying their presence in the story for the first few hours, as I thought they were almost at odds with the tone of 16. But as the story unfolded and you start to understand why these characters are the way they are, my opinion on them turned around completely. Yes, they are completely ridiculous at points, but once I accepted this and started to embrace their over-the-top natures, I had a great time watching their stories unfold. After 16's bombastic opening sequence, the pace slows down a lot. 16 starts out very linear, and the first few hours are extremely cutscene heavy, but it never felt too slow to me. 16 takes its time to ease you in, but this is necessary, as it has a very dense story filled with political intrigue, warring nations, and a sizable cast of complex characters. Even with its lengthy cutscenes doing their best to break things down, there is still a lot to take in, and it could be easier to get lost with all of the names of characters and locations being thrown at you in the early hours of 16. Fortunately, Creative Business Unit 3 was well aware of this and came up with an ingenious solution: active time lore. At any time, you can pause Final Fantasy XVI and view information about the characters, locations, objects, and terms being discussed or shown on screen. This is so clever, and I don't know why we don't see more games experimenting with ideas like this. It helps you keep things straight and prevents all the fictional terminology being used from getting overwhelming. While Final Fantasy XVI is fairly well paced for such a lengthy game, its pacing still isn't perfect, and the game does run into some pacing problems 2/3 of the way through. The second act builds and builds, then crescendos with a huge climactic sequence that was the most exciting part of the entire game for me. After this, the story slows down drastically for a few hours, and 16 has to rebuild its momentum all over again. It also doesn't help that it's around this point that the story goes a little off the rails, and starts dumping a ton of jargon about magical crystals on you in traditional Final Fantasy fashion. 16's story just gets a bit too grand for its own good at times. 16 is at its best when it's slightly smaller scale and focused on Clive and his relationships with his allies. Those are the parts of the story that are the most memorable and resonant. After a couple of hours, the pace does start to ramp up again, thanks largely to an increased focus on certain side characters, like Dion, who despite only playing a major role in the back half of 16, still has a full and satisfying character arc, and managed to become one of my favourite characters in 16. And when things do get rolling again in the third act, it's relentless all the way to the credits. 16 just pummels you with endless twists and turns, and all the story payoffs you've been waiting for. From the second it was revealed, it was clear that Final Fantasy XVI was pushing the series in a darker, more mature direction. It reminded me a bit of Final Fantasy Type 0 in this sense. But 16 takes things much further than Type 0 did. 16 is surprisingly bloody and violent right off the bat, opening with some grisly scenes of war, and as one of the trailers for 16 showcased, there's a scene early on in the game where a character is decapitated with their blood gushing over Joshua's face. 16 also features sex and swearing to a degree that no prior Final Fantasy game has. 10 years ago, I certainly would have never expected to see the main character of a Final Fantasy game scream "I'll fucking kill you" during the prologue. Final Fantasy XVI doesn't shy away from touching on very serious subject matter. In this world, people who can use magic are known as bearers, and they're treated like dirt. They're enslaved, branded, and used as tools, then discarded once they've served their purpose. This confronting imagery shows how awful this world is, and sets the stakes for how important it is that Clive succeeds in his quest to change things. The one concern I had with 16's darker direction was that it might end up coming off as more edgy than mature, like Stranger of Paradise did. But that's never the case. Final Fantasy XVI's darkness all feels like it's in service of telling a more adult story in the Final Fantasy universe, which it successfully does. Creative Business Unit 3 has openly stated that Game of Thrones was an inspiration for Final Fantasy XVI, and that shows in nearly every facet of the story. 16 not only has some strong tonal and thematic similarities to Game of Thrones, but even has some direct plot and character parallels. Because 16 is so much more mature than any prior Final Fantasy game, it is strange that there are occasionally points where 16 doesn't fully commit to its more adult tone. In particular, there's a sex scene early on in 16 where the woman is constantly moving her arm and the camera is shifting around to obscure her breasts, and it almost makes the scene read as comedic. It kind of reminded me of the reveal trailer for Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, or that one scene in Austin Powers. If you're making a game for adults, just commit to it. I don't think anybody's going to play a game where a man is decapitated with his blood splattering across a child's face in the opening hours, and characters say fuck every 5 minutes, but think seeing a topless woman is too much. While its story is great, and its characters are magnificent, the real star of Final Fantasy XVI is its sublime combat. Combat feels so good that I was going out of my way to engage every possible enemy just to have an excuse to keep fighting. Unlike the Final Fantasy games of old, Final Fantasy XVI is an action RPG, with its combat sharing more in common with character action games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta than the classic turn-based Final Fantasy games. That's not to say that 16 abandons its roots altogether, as you can still see the influence of other Final Fantasy games, with combat having hints of 7 Remake, 15, and even 13, in that 16 also has a heavy focus on staggering enemies to deal massive damage to them. 16's moment-to-moment gameplay will feel familiar to all fans of action games. You're stringing together combos of sword attacks, holding down square to slam down on enemies with a charged attack that imbues Clive's sword with flames, firing off ranged magic to keep enemies at bay, dashing around between enemies, dodging and weaving out of the way of unblockable enemy attacks, then parrying their strikes to leave them open for a counter-attack. Swordplay feels fittingly frenetic, and landing a perfectly timed precision dodge, slowing down time, then delivering a crushing precision counterattack is always satisfying. What makes Clive so much more powerful than other warriors is that he's no ordinary dominant. Through touching another dominant, he can absorb and wield the power of their icon. Equipping each icon gives you access to a whole new suite of special techniques, as well as a unique icon feat. This gives Final Fantasy XVI's combat near endless depth and variety. Unlike the character action games that inspired it, Final Fantasy XVI lets you get as showy as you like in combat, but also allows players who aren't necessarily skilled enough to pull off lengthy combos to scrape by using only the bare basics. Clive's icon is Ifrit, who has a plethora of flame-based abilities, but the first icon abilities you'll utilise are the powers of the Phoenix, which are bestowed upon Clive by Joshua. My favourites of which were Rising Flames, which sends enemies flying upwards with a powerful strike, and Flames of Rebirth, which entombs enemies in a barrage of flames, while also restoring health to Clive. The first icon feat you'll gain access to is Phoenix Shift, which allows you to quickly dash forward in a burst of flames, allowing you to close the gap between Clive and his opponent, or quickly dash out of the way of danger. While there are other powerful icon feats, Phoenix Shift was the one I used the most throughout the entirety of 16. It's useful in every single encounter, and knocking an enemy to the ground, then dashing to them and plunging your sword through them to finish them off while they're downed is so gratifying. I won't talk about the icons Clive gets access to later in the game to avoid spoiling major story beats. I'll just talk about one of the other icons you get early on, which is the wind icon Garuda, who has some speedy abilities that can shred through an opponent's stagger gauge in a matter of seconds. Garuda also has another one of my favourite icon feats, Deadly Embrace. This allows you to pull enemies towards you, and it can even be used to pull large enemies to their knees once you've depleted half of their stagger gauge. All up, Clive can wield the abilities of 8 different icons. You get the first few icons fairly quickly back to back, which gives you a good selection of abilities to play with. But after that, the rate at which you're getting new icons slows down a lot, and the rest are slowly drip-fed to you throughout 16's meaty runtime, which certainly isn't a bad thing, because just when you're starting to get into a rut of using the same handful of abilities you've gravitated towards, 16 always throws you a whole new batch of abilities to experiment with and work into your playstyle. You're even able to have multiple icons equipped at once, switching between them on the fly by pressing L2. So when one icon's special abilities are on cooldown, you can switch to another icon and keep fighting without missing a beat. And once you've mastered an ability by upgrading it a few times, you'll even be allowed to equip it to any icon. So if you like the icon feat of one particular icon, but don't like their special moves, 16 has you covered. All of this lets you customize your moveset to an insane degree. There's a ridiculous amount of powers to swap in and out, so you can string together near limitless different combos. Final Fantasy XVI's combat encounters are kept engaging by its massive, diverse lineup of enemy types. 16 offers a great variety of both new and returning enemies, with the designs of many of these opponents leaning into 16's darker tone. The goblins you fight in 16 certainly aren't the cutesy, cartoony goblins you'd find in a classic JRPG. Instead, they're grotesque, monstrous-looking creatures with red eyes and razor-sharp teeth that make gnarly hissing sounds while attacking you. My literal only complaint with 16's combat is how easy it is. I was blazing through most battles, dying only a few times throughout the entire game, and normally only during optional fights. This problem could have been alleviated entirely if I was just able to bump up the difficulty, but 16 forces you to finish the game before you can access its hard difficulty, Final Fantasy mode. This is just annoying. There's no reason to not let players dive into the harder difficulty right off the bat if they want to. I assume Creative Business Unit 3 did this to incentivize a second playthrough, which would be fine if we were talking about a shorter game, like Resident Evil for example, which also forces you to unlock higher difficulty levels, but 16 is a long game, so expecting a second playthrough is asking a lot of your players. One of the big selling points for Final Fantasy XVI is its epic Eicon fights, where dominants fully transform into their Eicon, leading to what are essentially massive kaiju battles. These boss fights are unbelievably fun. The sense of scale and spectacle these battles offer is incomparable to anything I've seen in a game before, and the way they continue to escalate throughout the game is mind-blowing. Final Fantasy XVI's production values are through the roof, and you can see 16's massive production budget on show in these fights. Eicon battles aren't just one set thing either. While some are basic one-on-one fights with two giants clashing, others are more like on-rails Star Fox-esque shooting galleries. These Eicon fights also make the best use of QTEs I've seen in a game in many years. Between Final Fantasy XVI, Tears of the Kingdom, and Jedi Survivor, and with Spider-Man 2 still on its way, 2023 is one hell of a year for spectacular action set pieces in games. The Eicon battles were a huge creative swing by Creative Business Unit 3, but they paid off dividends. These spectacular battles are among the best boss fights I've ever experienced in a game. Even the more grounded boss fights that see Clive clashing swords with another human are more exciting than 99% of boss fights in other games, thanks to both 16's amazing combat mechanics and the extraordinary sword choreography that's showcased in 16's cutscenes. Unlike its predecessor Final Fantasy XV, Final Fantasy XVI isn't open world. Instead, you use a world map to travel between areas. It's basically going for that wide linear approach, like the modern Tomb Raider trilogy or the last two God of War games. This formula fits Final Fantasy perfectly, and it gives 16's world a degree of focus that 15 lacked. Plus, it doesn't feel disjointed due to how quickly 16 loads you into different areas. It takes only a couple of seconds to travel anywhere on the map, so it's evident that Creative Business Unit 3 knows how to take full advantage of the PS5's SSD. Even though 16 isn't open world, there are still plenty of big environments to explore, and traversing them on foot would feel like a colossal waste of time. This is where Clive's trusty chocobo, Ambrosia, comes into the picture. At nearly any point while exploring, you can summon Ambrosia to ride around on. Can we all just agree that chocobos are the best in-game mounts? They're just so cool looking. While Final Fantasy XVI still retains many of the series' staples and recurring story themes, and keeps series icons like Moogles and Chocobo, it diverges from other Final Fantasy games in many ways. 16 is very light on RPG elements. While the skill tree offers plenty of ways to customise your moveset in combat, there are only a couple of pieces of gear to swap out. There's no armour, and you can't change your outfits, they just automatically change at certain points in the story. Another major difference between 16 and most other Final Fantasy games is that 16 doesn't have a party system. You have allies with you, but they come and go throughout the story, and you can't customise their equipment or abilities. And aside from Torgal, who you can issue some light commands to, you have no direct control over them whatsoever. Final Fantasy XVI is certainly more interested in being an action game than an RPG, and as a huge RPG fan, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I didn't even care. 16's gameplay and writing are that good. Something I feel compelled to call out is the odd handful of people who have been saying that 16 isn't a real Final Fantasy game. This is such an absurd take. Final Fantasy is a series that has reinvented itself countless times over the years, and it's going to continue to do so. Final Fantasy isn't one set thing. 4 drastically overhauled the series' gameplay by swapping true turn-based battles for the ATB system. And at its time of release, Final Fantasy VII was a huge stylistic departure from prior Final Fantasy games. I love turn-based games, and I'd love to see a mainline Final Fantasy game return to turn-based combat at some point. But just because 15 and 16 aren't turn-based, doesn't make them any less valid as Final Fantasy games. 16's most uneven aspect is without question its side missions, which range from dismal fetch quests to some of 16's most engaging stories that build out the lore of the world in meaningful ways. One side mission might be a gut-wrenching story that shows how terribly bearers are treated as you confront a father and son who are sending bearers to their deaths against wolves for entertainment. But then the next one you stumble across might be someone asking Clive to fetch samples of soil or gather letters that a courier lost, leaving you scratching your head as to why anyone would possibly be asking Clive to do this busy work when he clearly has much more important things to be doing. Yet despite their wildly uneven quality, I did every single side mission because, as I said earlier, I'd take any excuse to engage with Final Fantasy XVI's excellent combat. And to be fair, my devotion did eventually pay off, as in the back half of Final Fantasy XVI, the quality of the side missions skyrockets drastically, and there are some superb character-focused side missions that flesh out supporting cast members like Jill, Karen, Blackthorn, and even Torgal. These missions provide important context to these characters' backstories and motivations, and offer some of the best writing in all of 16. Lady Karen's quest is phenomenal, and if you're a pet owner, I'd be shocked if you didn't find the Torgal side quest touching. It so beautifully illustrates the bond between a pet and its owner. It's also worth noting that there are a handful of side quests that offer Clive some kind of permanent upgrade, like increasing the amount of potions he can carry. It's even through a side quest that Clive reunites with a certain feathered companion. For those who don't want to dredge through every single side mission to get to the few permanent upgrades, Final Fantasy XVI has a solution for you, as all the side missions that reward you with a permanent upgrade are marked with a green plus sign so you know not to skip them. The other major side activity you have access to in Final Fantasy XVI is hunts. Back at your home base, there's a Moogle named Nectar who you can talk to take on these hunts, and I recommend messing around with them as soon as you can, because I absolutely loved the hunts. Through accepting a hunt, Nectar will tell you where you can find a powerful monster to fight, but he only gives you a vague location of the creature, so once you get to that region, you'll have to scour the area for yourself to find the monster. This makes it feel like you're actually hunting down these creatures, and not just ticking off another side quest. These hunts also offer some of the most dynamic and challenging fights in all of 16. They're the only battles where I felt like I was being forced to utilise all of Clive's abilities, and still only scraping by the skin of my teeth. I finished Final Fantasy XVI at 70 hours, having seen and done everything. And even after playing it so extensively, I never burned out on 16, and I'm eager to do a second playthrough for the Platinum at the end of the year when the endless flood of games finally slows down. Final Fantasy games have long been known for having some of the most exceptional and powerful soundtracks in the gaming landscape, to the point that there have been countless live concerts all across the globe dedicated to the music of Final Fantasy. So it probably comes as no surprise when I say that Final Fantasy XVI's soundtrack is extraordinary. It's epic, emotional, and dramatic, and it never fails to elevate big story moments. I feel like I got chills every single time 16's main theme started to kick in during a cutscene. I know we still have a lot of games to come in 2023, but I would be flabbergasted if this wasn't my soundtrack of the year when all is said and done. Final Fantasy XVI is also utterly gorgeous. Its environment design is stunning. 16 is full of beautiful fields and lavish medieval castles, and these environments are so meticulously detailed that I found myself regularly stopping to soak in all the little details, like the way the sun breaks through the trees when you're exploring a forest. 16's main characters are also impressively detailed and flawlessly animated, though this is definitely one of those games where you can immediately tell which characters are going to be important by their appearance alone, because the main characters look incredible, while some of the random NPCs that pop up in cutscenes are dead-eyed and generic looking. You will also encounter a flat texture here and there, but none of this is enough to detract from how impressive 16's visuals are overall. 16's presentation is immaculate all around. I adore the small touches, like the pixel art versions of the cast that you see in the menu when you go to change your gear. The further we get into 2023, the more convinced I become that this is the greatest year in video game history, and Final Fantasy XVI is yet another example of why I feel this way. Final Fantasy XVI is a triumph. Its combat is perfectly tuned to offer as much or as little depth as you crave. The obscene scale of the Eicon fights is unlike anything I've ever seen in a game before. The story is riveting, and Clive is arguably the greatest protagonist the Final Fantasy series has ever seen. Final Fantasy XVI is yet another strong contender in the race for Game of the Year, and it's left me more hungry than ever for more Final Fantasy. So bring on that recently announced DLC and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this review, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. You can find countless other reviews on my channel, including my recent review of Street Fighter VI, and be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming reviews of Pikmin 4 and Starfield as we continue through the greatest year in gaming history.